Earlier in the week, I did a call out for what I should do for my next video. There were 4 options that I gave. Would you like to see a film about palm trees grown in Paris? Would you like to see a film about lawn care? Would you like to see a film all about yuccas? Or finally, would you like to see a film all about when to feed your plants? And with over 100 votes cast, the winner was when to feed your exotic plants. So we've decided by public vote that we're going to do a video on when to feed your plants. Obviously, my channel looking at exotic plants for the garden. We're looking at when do we feed exotic plants, and there's various different fertilizers we can use. I did a video I think about 4 years ago now when I looked like got a 70s hairstyle, so I can check that out in the description below. That talks in detail about the different types of fertilizers. But in this video, we're going to look at when to feed your plants. And if you stick around later in the video, I'll give you another tip to boost early spring growth in your exotic plants. So we need to feed our plants when they're actively growing, and that really depends where you live and the time of year. So you don't feed your plants in winter when they're dormant. You want to feed them when they're starting into growth, maintaining growth, and then you want to stop the feeding or slow down the feeding when they're slowing down and going into a dormant phase when the temperature's cool at the end of the year. So now we're in spring. This is the time when plants need a feed, and depending on the plants, where they are grown, they may need different feeds and they may need a different feeding regime. So let's talk about the different situations now. Now, plants like this amazing Bootia palm here, which is growing in full sun. Now it's into April, spring is warming up, we've got beautiful sunny days. This is the time where you're going to give a general feed around the base of your palm trees, your shrubs, your bamboos, any sort of plants that are hardy, that have been outside all winter, established in the garden, could benefit from a general feed just around the soil area, around the plants. And what I like to use is sort of bloodfish and bone, bit of Gromor, something like that, where it's relatively slow release, not super strong, and balanced fertilizer that will just generally feed these plants, give them a pick-me-up in spring and get them off to a good start and continue good growth as we move throughout the year. So plants like this wonderful umbrella tree, the Schefflera here, this will also benefit from a general fertilizer over the ground, scratching to the surface, maybe with a little hand fork as well. And that just helps keep these beautiful leaves nice and green throughout the spring into the summer, and it also promotes new growth from the top and the side shoots as well, without being too rich in nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium. A nice balanced fertilizer will just mean you'll get nice steady growth, and this is the time to do it now that we've got into spring and the soil is starting to warm up. The nutrients can be uptaken by the roots, and make sure that the plants get the nutrients where they need it, at the roots. And then later on in the year we can think about using other fertilizers, but at the moment it's generally just at the soil level where we give that fertilizer. Now, a lot of plants, especially palm trees, can look a bit yellowish after winter, not looking that vibrant green colour, and that is because over the cold months of winter and early spring, it's too cold at the soil level for the roots to uptake the nutrients they need. So they use what's there stored in their trunk and their roots that have stored from last year, but at this time of year they're probably exhausted a lot of that nutrients and they start looking a bit yellowish, a bit off green. But as soon as you feed that, they will start to be able to take up the nutrients, providing the soil is warm enough. And now, as we move through April into May, when the soil is warming up, they can take those nutrients up. So now is the time to put the fertilizer around the plants on the ground. If you did this in middle of winter, first of all, they don't need those nutrients as much in winter because they're pretty much dormant. And secondly, The elements, the wind, the rain, the snow, they would wash away a lot of those nutrients from the fertilizer before the plant can actually use it. So there's no point using fertilizers like that in winter. So again, a balanced feed is key to spring. You don't want to promote too much of one type of growth, either roots, fruits, or growth of leaves at this time of year. You want a nice balanced fertilizer for hardy shrubs, for palm trees, for bamboos, and for anything that's established in the ground. And really, if it's a very established plant, fertilizer is great to add, but it's not completely necessary for a lot of plants. Yes, probably for palm trees if you want to keep them looking super vibrant, but the old trackies behind me here, I don't feed them too much and they just get on with it. They find enough nutrients from the ground. Grown in pots is a completely different matter, and we'll move on to potted plants right now. Now, when it comes to potted plants, and I'm talking about potted plants that have been indoors over winter in a house on a windowsill, in the greenhouse, especially heated greenhouses, they'll be struggling through the winter months because the light levels aren't there. They're trying to grow because of some heat in the house or the greenhouse, but without that light, they can't really do what they need to do. So you don't need to feed them too often, if at all, over winter, especially things like cacti, which you'll leave completely dormant, but more leafy plants like the irisine, plectranthus, house plants, things that have been just sort of ticking along over winter. Now is the time to give them a little feed. You can do this depending on where you live, sort of in February, in March and April, and it really just sort of wakes them up and gets them sort of growing early-ish. So something I like to use is seaweed fertilizer, because it's not a true heavy sort of fertilizer with lots of nutrients. It's got lots of minor nutrients and all those sort of growing sort of growth hormones in there to allow them to get into spring growth. So I like to do a foliar feed as well as a liquid drench over the pots. You don't want to do this too early in the year, like I said, because the plants don't need it, and you don't want to water them too much if they're cold conditions. But now it's warming up, we've got longer and more sunny days, and definitely give them a feed. And then as we move into summer, we can give them a more nutrient-rich feed on a weekly basis just to keep them growing, because obviously in pots they don't have their roots going into the soil where they can get pretty much unlimited nutrients as they grow through the soil. In pots, in containers, all the food they're going to get is what you provide them. So obviously by repotting is great to do, and mulching, but giving them fertilizer will allow them to grow as best they can. So early spring, give them a dousing of seaweed fertilizer, maybe a liquid tomato feed, something like that, and then further in the summer do your regular feeding, something like a half strength Miracle Grow or tomato feed, and keep on top of maybe doing a seaweed feed every so often as well. Now, plants that are dormant over winter but then put on their growth, like herbaceous shrubs, bananas, and this big gunnery here, although it's not too big at the moment, it won't be long till it is very big. These plants need a lot of food, but not yet. These plants have been asleep all winter. If you've got Musa baju in the ground, you've just unwrapped it. They're slowly starting to get into growth, but basically they've been asleep for pretty much 6 months. And if you try to force feed this lots and lots of feed, it will not help. You need to make sure that you feed this gently to begin with. And then when it gets into full growth, sort of into May, into late May, then you can up the feeding. So if you feed this too early, what happens is it's basically going to sit in all that plant food and all that fertilizer. If you put chicken pellets down now, a lot of them will get washed away when it rains, won't feed the plants because they can only take up so many nutrients when it's still relatively cool at the ground. When it warms up further and we get nighttime temperatures much warmer, then you can pile on the feed for hungry plants like brugmansias, like bananas, like the gunneras. You can give it lots of chicken pellets, you can give it seaweed, you can give it everything, and it will grow absolutely huge, nitrogen-rich feeds, especially for these big leaved plants. But do it too early and you're just wasting your money on the fertilizer, washing away. The plant can't take up all those nutrients quite yet. few more weeks, yes they can, but right now it's a little too early to pile on the fertilizer around herbaceous plants and those plants that get huge leaves later in the year. So I've shown in this video when to feed your plants and the different types of plants and feeds that we may use. Now there is another tip I want to give you, and that is how to boost early growth, especially in slow growing plants like palm trees that really need hot summer temperatures to get into proper fast growth. But this will also work on bananas and other plants you want to give an early boost to. But a word of caution, the technique I'm going to talk about has some drawbacks, namely by promoting early growth. If you get a late frost, it will really set back plants, especially like your tenderish plants that you've put out early. And it can also harm early growth on palm trees as well. So this technique is quite simple and you've probably heard of it, and that is the warm water technique. That is getting water in a watering can, and rather than using a cold tap, using the warm tap from the house, getting it to about 30-35 degrees, so sort of hand warm, not super hot because that will damage plants, but just warm, and watering plants and giving it a good watering can full around a palm tree, something that's quite slow growing. If you do this regularly, every few days, every week, obviously not trying to waterlog the plants, but keeping that soil warm early. So if you start this in March and April, you'll get that earlier growth than if you just let the rain and general cold water from a watering can. By using this warm water, you get that earlier growth. And this has been recorded by somebody called Greville over 10-15 years ago on the Hardy Tropicals forum, where he meticulously recorded the temperature of the water of various palm trees and the actual growth on a day by week basis, measuring the spears of the palm trees and comparing them to ones that he didn't use the warm water against. And he could quite clearly demonstrate that by using that warm water, it warmed up the ground and it made plants think it was later in the year than it really was, and it allowed plants to grow that bit earlier. So that is a good technique if you want to get an early boost of plants, especially palm trees. But like I said, a word of caution, if you do get a late frost, it can set back the plants. So be careful if you choose to do this technique. Now, I hope you found this video useful, and if you do so, please give it a like, subscribe if you've not already done so, comment below and I can answer any questions you may have, and let me know what you like to feed your plants in spring, and then we can talk about what feeds to use later on in the year as well.